Good evening, everyone. I am Utkarsh Punjabi, and welcome back to the Grass channel. Together, we make grass greater than chess. Okay, so before we dive into our first episode, there are a couple of housekeeping items. First and foremost, thank you. Thank you to everyone who has reached out with kind, thoughtful messages and have shown tremendous support. I truly, truly appreciate it. Second, I've received a small request from friends and family from India that I should record the episodes in both English and Hindi. I don't want language barrier to be the reason why someone can't enjoy the content that we put out. When we came to this country, I didn't speak any English at all, so I know that feeling. Now, I'm not making any promises, but I'll certainly give it a try. Third, as I was preparing for this episode, there are two articles that I came across that I wanted to share with everyone. Let me go ahead and pull up the first one. The first article is about a 5-year-old girl in Delhi. Her name is Aranya Bedi. She has sold self-illustrated books on coronavirus to help people. And here's what she had to say. Again, she's only 5 years old. I saw from the balcony that there are so many persons who do not have food to eat, and they're called poor. So many people were lined up in long queues only to eat food. I wrote this book because I wanted to sell it online and give the money to arrange food for these people. So far, she has completed 10 books and raised 1 lakh rupees by partnering up with 2 NGOs in India, all to feed the needy. Just truly incredible. Now, here's the second article. The second article is about a 99-year-old British World War II veteran, Captain Tom Moore. He promised to walk 100 laps around his garden before his 100th birthday. What was his goal? His goal was to raise 1,000 pounds or 1,250 US dollars to help the NHS staff and volunteers. Well, as it turns out, he ended up raising 32.8 million pounds, or roughly 38 million US dollars. Just truly, truly incredible. Now, whatever your philosophy on life is, whatever your Darwinian or Socratic approach to life is, this just goes to show you that the human spirit, the act of kindness, can range from someone as young as 5 years old, living in India, in Delhi, to someone who's 99 years old and is a British World War II veteran. And fourth, and finally, the fourth and last housekeeping item. If you haven't watched our welcome video on the purpose behind the inception of this channel, I'll go ahead and put a link in the comment section below as well as towards the end of the video, and please do check it out. If you want to be a part of our COVID-19 relief efforts in the smallest way possible, all you have to do is like, subscribe, and share the video with as many people as possible. You can share it with your friends and family at the bar, at the library, everyone. So that's it. Now, let's go ahead and get started on our first episode. So when I decided that I was going to go ahead and get on YouTube, open this channel, and it was going to be about chess, there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that the first episode would be on one of my heroes and one of the greatest chess players of all time, Viswanathan Vishy Anand, the Lightning Kid, the Madras Tiger himself. And just to give you an overview on why Anand is considered to be one of the greatest players of all time, let me take you back in time. So FIDE started handing out the Grandmaster or the GM titles in 1950. For the first 38 years, so from 1950 to 1987, India had managed to produce 0 Grandmasters until Anand became the first one. For the first 50 years of our known universe, our known human history, India had managed to produce 3 Grandmasters from 1950 to 1999. That accounted for roughly 0.4% of all the Grandmasters that were awarded in the first 50 years. Well, how about the last 20 years? So from the year 2000 until now, India has managed to produce 62 Grandmasters, from 3 to 62. That accounts for roughly 5.4% of the Grandmasters in the last 20 years, which is about a 1,200% jump. Now, if you asked all those Grandmasters who their inspiration was and who's someone that they looked up to, it would be none other than the Madras Tiger, Viswanathan Anand himself. I think recently Anand turned 50 years old, and just imagine that an average age of a Grandmaster is around 21 years old now, and he's competing at the age of 50 years old, and he's still truly, truly incredible on what he's doing. Okay, now it wasn't hard to pick Anand as the first individual who we would pay tribute to. The hard question was picking one game out of his illustrious career to review in our today's video. How do you do that? Do you pick his game against the Minister of Defense, Sergei Karyakin, in 2006? Or do you pick the game against Laurier in 1997? How about his game against Kamsky in 1995? Or the one against great Garry Kasparov in 1995? Let's not forget about the game against Kramnik in 2008. The answer is you simply cannot pick one game. So after spending about 10 hours reviewing all the games, I went back and looked at what other chess legends had to say about Vishy's games. There are 2 games that stood out. One is against Levon Aronian in 2013, and the other is the great Chucky Ivanchuk in 1992. Now, just ridicule the idea that 2 of Anand's greatest games are 21 years apart, 1992 and 2013. It is mind-blowing. So, for today's purposes, we'll cover the game against Levon Aronian played in 2013. Anand himself called this the most beautiful game he has ever played. Chess.com surveyed its staff and some of the members, some of the contributors in March 2019, and they ranked this the 3rd best game of all time. The best game of the 21st century by far. Even Magnus Carlsen called it an immortal game. Okay, so now that we have set the stage, let's go back in 2013 and see what the world was like. So Anand was a world champion. He was ranked 2772, and Aronian was actually ranked 30 points higher at 2802. This tournament is a part of the annual tradition, the Tata Steel Tournament, which started, I believe, back in 1938 and has been played every single year except for, of course, 1945. It is played in your favorite city, obviously, Wijk aan Zee in the Netherlands. Also, if I'm not mistaken, prior to this game, Anand and Aronian had played 24 head-to-head classic games. 18 of them were draws. Aronian had won 5, and Anand had only managed to defeat Aronian just once. So after the game, as Anand said, Aronian was his absolute Angstgegner. A German for an opponent, a player or team tends to lose to on a regular basis. So as he said, the end result was doubly sweet for this reason. Now that we have set the stage, we know the stakes, let's go ahead and dive into this masterpiece and let's see what happened. Okay, so Aronian has the white pieces, Anand has the black pieces, and Aronian opens with d4, the queen's pawn opening. Anand replies with d5. Aronian goes for c4, and we have queen's gambit on the board. Anand rejects the queen's gambit and instead goes for the Slav defense with c6. Knight to f3, main line of the Slav defense. Knight to f6, the modern line of the Slav defense, and knight to c3. And we have the 3 knights variation of the Slav defense. Anand goes for e6, and there are a couple of ideas here. One of them, well, Aronian actually plays e3 and transitions into the semi-Slav defense. But what he has been playing recently nowadays is bishop to g5. Let's take a look at what happens when you transition into bishop to g5. By the way, bishop to g5, this is known as the Botvinnik variation of the semi-Slav defense, named after, of course, Mikhail Botvinnik, one of the best players of all time. And if you are someone who enjoys naturally aggressive positions, and especially if you're playing with someone who's an aggressive player by nature, Mikhail Botvinnik might be your guy. So of course, there are a lot of ideas here. One of them is just as simple as h6. The other is knight to d7. But the one that I want to show you is the most explosive one. So let's see what happens if black decides to surrender the center and capture on c4. Well, by capturing on c4, you are inviting e4, setting up the attack against the knight, as well as your pawn on c4. Let's see what black would play here. Black would go for b5, defending the knight on c4 and going for a rapid acceleration on the queen side. As we noted, white would still go for e5, attack the knight, h6, attacking the bishop, bishop back to h4, g5, still attacking the bishop. And now you have, again, a couple of ideas, right? You can just bring the bishop back and the knight would go back and everything would be okay. You can transition into this game, but that's not why we are seeing this this variation or this line. So the craziest idea would be if knight decides to temporarily sacrifice the pieces and capture on g5. So knight captures on g5, h captures on g5, bishop captures on g5, and finally, again, you have a couple of ideas. One of them is you can just have bishop to e7, defend the knight, and you would just go into a capture fest. But the more interesting line is knight to d7, adding a second defender. Now, let's take a snapshot of this position. Why would white play this? Well, the obvious reason is, as you're seeing, the king side is completely shattered for black. So white will go for g3, fianchetto the bishop on the light square, and castle. And you can go ahead and capture this knight anytime you want. Now the question is, well, it is black who decided to surrender the center and go into this line. What's in it for black? Well, black is going to fianchetto the bishop on b7, take queen to b6, castle, and genuinely enjoy these two beautiful diagonals. Oh. These two diagonals. Also, black has a lot of counterplay on the queen side as well as the center. Black will expect to push c5, b4, and try to attack the knight on c3. So let's see what happens here. You have g3 as we said. Black would fianchetto the bishop on b7, bishop to g2, white fianchettos the bishop on the light square bishop, queen to b6, and now of course this is a perfect time for you to capture the knight and enjoy a slight bit of advantage. So e captures on f6, we have castle from black, castle from white, c5, d5, and b4. Now there are two ideas that are equally as good. One of them is knight goes to a4, and the other is rook comes to b1. In either cases, you're going to open up a b file if you are white. So again, if you are someone who enjoys open, wild, crazy attacks, and you're playing with someone who's an aggressive player by nature as well, this is a beautiful, beautiful counterplay for both the white as well as the black. All right, so let's go back to our game. So after e6, the semi-Slav defense, we go into e3, the main line of the semi-Slav defense. Black replies, Anand replies with knight to b7, and we have a couple of ideas here again for Aronian. One of them is queen to c2, what's known as the Stolz variation of the semi-Slav defense. The idea behind queen to c2 is that you're going to go ahead and push e4, so gain additional squares in the center. And the other is, if black decides to castle on the king side, as it most often is done in the semi-Slav defense, you'll be eyeing that h7 square beautifully. So instead, Aronian actually decides to play just a slight different variation, but eventually gets to the same stage. So instead, after knight to d7 from Anand, Aronian goes for bishop to d3, inviting black to surrender the center, attack the bishop, and also have some beautiful counterplay on both sides. So let's see what Anand does. So Anand indeed captures the pawn on c4 and goes into the rapid development on the queen side. So bishop captures on c4, b5, attacking the bishop and gaining a slight tempo on that bishop. Now, of course, Aronian has three different options. One of them is to bring the bishop back to b3. The other is bishop to e2. And the most popular is bishop back to d3. And indeed, Aronian goes for bishop to d3. Now here, Anand actually throws the first curveball of the game. The usual ideas are pawn to a6, or you want to go ahead and fianchetto the bishop on b7. Then you have some ideas of pushing c5 or bringing the rook onto the c file. But instead, Anand goes for bishop to d6. And we'll see why bishop to d6 is a very nice idea just in a couple of seconds. So after bishop to d6, Aronian goes for castle. We have castle from Anand and queen to c2. Before queen to c2, let's actually see what the madness behind bishop to d6 from Anand was. So instead of bishop to d6, I'm sorry, after bishop to d6 and after you have castled, if white decides to push e4, let's see what happens. So we get e4, e5, d captures on e5, we go into a massive capture fest. Knight captures on e5, knight captures on e5, and finally, this bishop is useful because now you can capture the knight back on e5. Let's take a snapshot of this position and let's see who's winning. I shouldn't say winning. Who has a positional advantage? Well, you have this beautiful bishop on this diagonal. You have this beautiful bishop on this diagonal. Also, if needed, you can fianchetto the bishop and bring it on this diagonal. This knight is ready to jump into either the h5 square or g4 square, and as soon as the knight moves, the queen will most definitely follow. So the idea behind bishop to d6 is that if white tries to expand in the center, it is black who will enjoy the positional advantage. Okay, so of course, Aronian does not go for e4. Instead, he goes for queen to c2, going for the Moran variation. We have bishop to b7, fianchettoing the light square bishop from Anand. A3. A3 is actually a very instinctive idea. The reason behind A3 being an instinctive idea is, of course, we can see that Anand is trying to push c5 to open up this diagonal for its bishop. So if that indeed happens, how would it happen? Well, naturally you would see, naturally, as well as how it is most likely played, you would see a6, c5. So when you play c5, your b5 pawn is actually protected, and you have opened up this diagonal. However, in this case, white can push b4, stop any ideas of c5, and make this bishop look slightly foolish for the time being. So a3 is actually a very instinctive idea. Also, by playing a3, you're guarding b4, so you are not letting any additional attackers come to c3. Okay, so let's see what happened in the game. So after a3, Anand goes for rook to c8. Now that's interesting. Why is that interesting? Because black still wants to push c5, but your b5 pawn is not protected. And again, as we'll see throughout this game, and I think Anand said it after the game as well in multiple interviews, also in his book, that you are genuinely just sacrificing the pawn on b5 because you have a certain permutation, certain line that you're trying to go into. Okay, so now the idea for Aronian is, can you play b4? b4, I believe there are 64 games in chess database that have reached this position. 44 times b4 has been played. And again, it makes sense because you're trying to gain control of the c5 square. And we'll focus on the c5 square multiple times as the game progresses. So let's see what would happen if white decides to play b4. Also, this b4 idea would be a very, very Karpovian move. Karpovian move after one of the greatest players of all time, Anatoly Karpov, who very much, if I were to create some sort of symmetry to other sports, think of Anatoly Karpov as Bill Belichick of football or Greg Popovich from basketball. as an opponent, you have a certain idea in mind heading into a game on how you're trying to attack or how you will attack. Both Greg Popovich and Bill Belichick will make sure that you can't do or you are not able to do that one thing that you prepared. So, and Anatoly Karpov was 100% the same psychologically, or had the same psychological principles as Bill Belichick or Greg Popovich. And I think in one of the interviews, he even said, if you asked him, would he prefer to play some beautiful peace sacrifice plays that are just massively popular in the chess culture, or would he rather play just a tough, grind out theoretical battles? He would rather prefer the tough, grind out theoretical battles. So let's see what would happen in b4, trying to gain the control of c5. Well, black would still go for c5. B captures on c5. Bishop captures on f3. And now white has two options. One is to capture this bishop or to capture this bishop. Let's go ahead and see if white decides to capture the bishop on f3. So you have g captures on f3. G captures on f3. Knight captures on c5. So far, black has lost two pieces for just a knight. Okay, so knight to c5. D captures on c5. Rook captures on c5. And now white will have to be careful. Why? Because you know that this knight is coming to d5 to put an additional attacker on c3, as well as the queen will have this beautiful diagonal open for itself, and you don't want to get checkmated. So what's the idea? White will have to play f4, blocking any potential attacks against the white king. Okay, so you still get knight to d5, adding a second attacker. Now you have bishop to b2, adding a second defender. Knight captures on c3, bishop to h7, an in-between move to win that pawn back, king to h8, and now finally you have bishop captures on c3. So as you can see, throughout the game, this queen has been pinned, and now it is still pinned. Queen to c7, adding a second attacker. Rook to c1, adding a second defender. Rook to c8, adding a third attacker. And rook to d1. So if we go into a massive capture fest, at the end, you can go ahead and capture the bishop on d6. And indeed, we do go into a massive capture fest. Captures, 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 and captures. So let's take a snapshot of this position. Both white and black have a rook and 5 pawns. Yeah, you have 2 pawns on the f file, and you have 3 different pawn islands, but as the saying goes, rook and pawn endgames are almost always draws. And I believe the same variation has been played multiple times, and I think each time the end game, the end result has been a draw. Okay, so let's go back to this position. So we have already seen that if white decides to capture on f3, the end result, with some trickiness behind f4, is most certainly a draw. Well, let's see what happens if white decides to capture on d6. So we have c captures on d6, knight to d5, adding a second attacker to the pinned knight. G captures on f3, just sacrificing the bishop. That bishop has served its purpose. And finally, queen to g5 with a check. So you will most definitely want to be careful here, and we'll see why. So king to h1, queen to h5. The idea behind queen to h5 is you want to go ahead and attack the pawn on f3 and just harass the white king. So after queen to h5, you'll have to play bishop to e2, adding a protection to the pawn on f3. But now you get knight captures on c3, attacking that bishop. Now from here on, the game would continue. It would be a theoretical struggle, as most certainly the great Anatoly Karpov would have enjoyed. And again, if you put it into any engine, it might say 0.5 in the favor of black or 0.5 in the favor of white. But most certainly this would be a draw. And I'm pretty sure the great Karpov wouldn't have it any other way. Okay, so after rook to c8, let's see what was played. Also, I think we have already discussed e4, right? That if you go into e4, you're going to go into a massive capture fest and nothing changes. So instead, Aronian has prepared knight to g5, adding a third attacker to the pawn on h7. And this is where the immortal game of Anand begins. Now let's see, what's the idea behind knight to g5? Well, first of all, the most common idea that you would think of would be h6. After h6, you would get knight to g4, attacking both bishop, knight, as well as the center control of the c5 pawn, c5 square. Like I said, we'll come back to that c5 square multiple times throughout the game. Now, of course, black will just take the bishop back because this bishop is way too valuable right now. And most likely you would see b4 here, right? And the great Karpov would appreciate this setup, as the battle for the c5 square would begin, and it would be a theoretical struggle for both black and white. So that's not the way you ideally want to play this. So let's see, what's the idea? What's the other idea behind knight to g5? Well, there is this sneaky idea of bishop captures on h2 with a check, of course. King captures on h2, knight to g4 with a check, king goes back to g1, and now queen captures on g5. So far, white has sacrificed a pawn and a knight for a very active bishop, and let's see what would happen. You might think that this position is actually favorable for black, but it's not. So you would see f3 attacking the knight, knight goes back to f6, and now e4, opening up bishop's attack to the queen. And let's take a moment to pause and see what's happening. White has a beautiful control of the center square. It's also controlling all the diagonals that queen ideally wants to go to. Also, you can't go back because then we'll see e5, and the bishop's influence on this diagonal will open up as well. So this is turning into a very sad position for black. So the only real idea is queen to h4, trying to go for some control of the h-file, as you have some ideas of bringing the knight to g5 and going for the mating attack. But most likely you would see queen to f2 from white, just trying to exchange the queens, as the white certainly has a great positional advantage. And black just doesn't have anything to offer, right? Because this is such a sad position for the queen. So you would see a queen trade, and now white is just absolutely dominating. Most likely you would see the rook come to h file, add some attacker to the h2 pawns. This diagonal is waiting to open. This diagonal is already opened up, and it would be white that would have a tremendous counterplay. So if you are Vishy, after knight to g5, you don't want to play h6, and you certainly don't want to go for the pawn on h2, even though it looks very, very enticing. So instead, Anand quickly plays c5. You didn't forget about the c5 square, did you? So what's the madness behind the c5 square? Let's go ahead and appreciate it for a second. So we have been saying that this pawn on b5, it's just a free pawn, right? Well, let's see if it is indeed a free pawn. And if it is, you should capture it, especially if you can play an in-between move. Let's see what would happen. So there are two ways you can, of course, capture the pawn on b5. The first one is knight captures on b5, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn. And again, as we have mentioned throughout this game so far, that this bishop is tremendously useful. And let's see why that is the case. And this would be a very much forcing line from Black's perspective. So after knight captures on b5, you get bishop captures on h2, king captures on h2, knight captures on g4 with a check, king to g1, and now before you capture the knight, there is an in-between move, c captures on d4. Well, actually, let's take a moment. So after c captures on d4, this rook's the c file has absolutely opened up for a rook, and the rook will definitely have something to say about this. So you'll get queen to e2, attacking the knight, but now you see your natural queen captures on g5, gaining the piece back, f3, and now in this variation, because there is no pawn right there, you'll actually go for knight to e5, inviting this fork. And let's see why that fork is actually beautiful to enjoy. So you get f4, forking the knight, forking the queen, and now queen to g3. F captures on e5, and now knight captures on e5. And I'm sure you can all see it. This would be a quick mate. Queen is attacking the pawn on g2, and all Black has to do is basically just capture on d3, get queen away from the defense of g2, and it would be a mate in one. The other idea is you can bring this knight onto g4, and you have some mating attack on h2 as well. So this is just completely winning for Black. So even though you might think that this is a free pawn, it's not. And you could think about going for bishop captures on b5, but it's not really any, well, it's slightly better, but you essentially end up with the same idea where Black actually enjoys a genuine counterplay. So let's see, what else could you do? Could you go ahead and capture the pawn on c5? Let's see what happens if you do that. So d captures on c5, rook captures on c5, attacking this knight, and now you get f4. Again, f4 is important because not only are you defending the knight, but you're also blocking this bishop's diagonal for the time being. You get h6, knight to h7. The reason why you don't want to bring the knight back here is because you'll just see a knight trade, and this bishop's influence is still pretty good. So you get knight to h7, knight captures on h7, Bishop captures on h7 with a check. King to h8. Bishop to e4, just trying to exchange the bishop, especially this strong bishop. One of the strongest bishop actually. Bishop captures on e4. Queen captures on e4, and the game continues. But again, as you can see, Black genuinely has enough counterplay. So if you're Aronian, this is probably not the line that you want to go into, especially seeing that this rook is not doing a lot, this bishop is not doing a lot, and it is Black, right? The knight is ready to jump to f6, and then it'll have something to say on g4 as well as h5. The queen is ready to jump on this diagonal. This rook will double up either on the c file or even on the d file. So by the time you are done bringing your pieces out, Black will be on a pretty aggressive attack. Okay, so after c5, there are really only two ideas. One of them is bishop captures on h7. The other is knight captures on h7. Aronian plays knight captures on h7, but it is worth checking out bishop captures on h7 as well. I believe Samuel Savian and Wesley So had the same exact position. Samuel Savian was in 2015, I believe. Samuel Savian was 14 years old or 15 years old at the time. Wesley So was ranked 250 or 300 points higher than Samuel Savian. And again, right, like by that big of a margin, everyone just expected Wesley So to murder this poor kid. But after Wesley played bishop captures on h7, he went on to quickly lose the game. And that is another masterpiece that is essentially just a different variation. And I believe Anand also said that even though bishop captures on h7 is slightly better, they had prepared for both lines. So let's see what happens here. So bishop captures on h7, king to h8, and now you have two lines. One of them is what Anand believes could have happened in the game. So let's go ahead and check that one out, actually. So bishop to e4, just going into massive capture fest. So knight captures on e4, knight captures on e4, bishop captures on e4, knight captures on e4, and now c captures on d4, opening up the rook's influence on the c file. Again, even though if you put it into an engine again, you might see 0.5 in the favor of Black, 0.5 in the favor of White, depending on the engine you ask, how long you let it run. But in human chess, this is most certainly an advantage for Black. As you can see, this bishop, this knight, and this queen are already placed in an ideal situation, and there is a better harmony between the pieces compared to this rook, this bishop, well, and kind of this rook as well. Okay, so that's the line that Anand believes you could have actually gone into. But there is this other fun line, which involves after you play f4, Black actually goes for g6. The idea behind g6 is you're actually trapping this bishop. So you get bishop captures on g6, f captures on g6, and now you have multiple options, right? One is just bringing the queen into the game, which would most likely result in a draw. Well, I shouldn't say draw, which would most likely result in a positional advantage for Black. But the other fun line is knight captures on b5, attacking the bishop and attacking the pawn. So bishop back to b8. Black would most certainly try to protect both of its bishops because they are just monster bishops. So bishop to b8, knight captures on e6, forking the queen and the rook. Queen to b6, attacking the knight. Knight captures on f8, knight captures on f8, and finally queen to e2, protecting the knight as well as gaining some influence if something were to transpire on the queen side. Let's go ahead and appreciate this position for a second. This seems like if you just took a picture of this board and put it online, most people would think that this is a game from the Romantic era of chess, where Black has just decided to capture, Black has just decided to forego its rook and 5 pawns. But Black is about to just enjoy a tremendous, tremendous attack. So no, I mean, this would be genuinely enjoyable if you're Black, especially in a human chess, right? So after c5, of course, Aronian doesn't go for the pawn on b5. He doesn't go for the pawn on c5. He doesn't go for h7 through bishop, but instead he captures with the knight, attacking the rook on f8. Now there are certainly a couple of ideas that that Black has. One of them is most certainly, let's see what would happen if you get knight captures on h7. So if you get knight captures on h7, bishop to h7, king to h8, bishop back to e4. We have kind of already seen this. Bishop captures on e4, and now queen captures on e4. The difference now is that it is white that has a move up, right? It has one tempo up. It has a direct access to the H file. This knight is on d7. It's not on f6, gaining any control, as well as even if you capture on d4, the queen is no longer pinned. So not the way you want to go into. So after knight captures on h7, there is actually one other sneaky idea, which is c4, attacking the bishop. So the way you want to play this, if you don't want to lose material, right? Like that's kind of a poisonous move, that if you just decide to move the bishop, you would go ahead and capture a free knight. And the reason why you won't be able to capture is because if you capture with the queen, king will gladly just take your queen. Also, you don't want to go into any funny ideas of knight captures on f8, because you get c captures on d3, attacking your queen, and of course you'll just have to capture the pawn, and you'll go into this line where Black has sacrificed its rook for an amazingly active bishop and a decently good knight, and Black still has all the threats that it wants to just impose upon you, right? So not the way you want to play it. So so after c4, the way you actually want to play this is knight captures on f6 with a check. You get knight captures on f6, and now bishop to e2. This is slightly better for Anand, but it would be a long theoretical drawn out game. So instead, after knight captures on h7, Anand plays knight to g4, and this is such a great move. And we'll see why this is such a great move. He's just ignoring everything that is happening towards its king. He's sacrificing the rook on f8, The two pawns are still hanging. So let's see what would happen if black indeed decides to capture the rook on f8. So knight captures on f8, and again, this would be a forced line. Bishop captures on h2, king to h1. Of course, you can't capture the bishop because it's protected by the knight. Queen to h4, and you're just quickly getting mated, right? The way you would have to play it is you would have to make some room for your king. So rook to d1, bishop to g3, opening up queen's influence on the h file with a check. King to g1, queen to h2 with a check nonetheless. King to f1, queen captures on g2 with a check. Right, your queen is still protected. King to e1. You don't want to go to e2 from here because then it's just queen captures on f2 with the checkmate in one. And now instead of queen captures on f2, you get bishop captures on f2, king to d2, bishop to e3 with a double check from. Bishop captures on e3 with a double check from the bishop and the queen. King back to e1, queen to g3 with a check, king to f1, queen to g1 with a check, and finally the square that you didn't want to go to. That's the only square you have available. So king to e2 and queen to f2 with a checkmate. So the rook on f8, even though black was sacrificing the rook, that was because it was a poisonous rook. And I'm not this smart like that, right? So after you get knight to g4, the other idea that you might have is, and which is probably a slightly safer idea, is g3. So let's see, what is the idea behind, h3 is a safer idea, but one of the ideas that you might think about is g3, just blocking bishop's influence on this diagonal. And again, this would be a very forced line again. So you get g3, knight to h2, and of course, I hope none of you are thinking about capturing the knight on h2, because then you will just get queen to h4 with a check, and it would be a mate in one. So let's check it out actually. So you get king captures on h2, queen to h4 with a check, and again you can't capture because your pawn is still pinned, and the only place you have to go is king to g1, but now queen to h1 with a mate, this bishop. So again, I hope none of you were thinking about, after playing g3, knight captures on h2, capture the knight. So instead, you'll have to go with, again, start making room for your king to run to. So you get rook to d1, knight to f3 with a check, king back to f1, c captures on d4, attacking the knight. But now you get knight captures on f8 since you have nothing left to do. You get knight captures on, knight to h2 with a check, king to e1, d captures on c3, knight captures on d7, queen captures on d7, and finally b captures on c3. Again, just take a look at the position here, right? White's pieces are so constricted into a small box, and the only right-handed piece that you have on the right side of the board is, I should say minor piece, is the king. This would be a very, very enjoyable position for black, and it would enjoy a checkmate rather quickly. So after knight to g4, you definitely don't want to capture, and you definitely don't want to play g3. So the safer idea here is actually h3. But h3 is slightly a counterintuitive move, right? If you think about it, you have spent the first 12 moves just in the opening theory And in the last two moves, you have set up an attack on h7, and all of a sudden, you're not going to reverse a thing and go into a safe mode, which would be h3. So let's see what would happen with h3. So h3, bishop to h2 with a check, king goes to h1, queen to h4, setting up all sorts of nasty attacks. But now you would have to play bishop to e4, just blocking any influence from this bishop. So you would get bishop captures on e4, queen captures on e4, queen captures on e4, f5, attacking the queen, but now you would just get queen to e6 with a check, king captures on h7, queen captures on d7, and you would go into a threefold repetition, and this would be a drawn endgame. So again, this is why, especially for an aggressive player like Levon Aronian, and most players, right, throughout chess history, h3, even though it is a safe move, it is a very, very counterintuitive move. So after knight to g4, Aronian actually finds a very resourceful idea with f4, just blocking this bishop and saying, hey, you don't have anything left. And I believe this is where Anand actually spent 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, because up until now, both Anand and Aronian had just blitzed, and both of them had over 1 hour, 30 minutes on the clock. So this is where Anand actually spends 30 minutes, and he recalls his preparation from 8 months earlier, back when he faced Boris Gelfand for the World Championship, which he won. So again, he said, I think in his book and in the interview, that he had remembered some sort of lines, but he just couldn't recall it, and he had to figure it out on the fly. And oh boy, did he do an amazing job of figuring out. Actually, feel free to pause the video and see what you would play, because the next 4 moves are what makes this game an immortal game. So pause the video, spend however much time you need, and let me take a sip of the water. Okay. So for those of you that found C captures on d4, congratulations. You have helped Anand create his immortal game, the first important move of the immortal game. And this is just a massively beautiful idea here. So after C captures on d4, Aronian very quickly played E captures on d4, but let's actually take a look at a nasty engine line, AI line. So I wanted to run this into engine and see what the engine said. I let it run overnight, and I think after 6 billion different permutations, this is the best that the engine could come up with. So let's see the engine line. So the engine line is knight to f8, knight captures on f8. Ridiculous, right? We just showed that knight captures on f8 was just so counterintuitive. You get king captures on f8, E captures on d4, queen to f6, going after the pawn, and setting up a beautiful attacking line. And now you would see queen to e2, finally unpinning and attacking the knight. Queen captures on d4 with a check, king to h1, knight to f6. So if queen decides to capture this knight is ready to take its position. But you get h3, knight to h5, and of course the reason behind that is if you go ahead and capture, you're going to quickly get mated, because you'll see knight come to g3, and this would be not just any fork, it would be a royal family fork, because of course, there's one fork between three people. You get the king, you get the queen, and you get the rook. So the way you want to actually play this is queen captures on g4. Queen captures on d3, so just taking that monster knight for a bishop. Now rook to d1, attacking the queen, and now you get knight to g3 with the check. And again, you would see a threefold repetition, and not most likely, this would most certainly end in a draw. So after c2, c captures on d4, according to the engine and 6 billion different permutation, the best AI line is knight captures on f8, just absolutely crazy. So instead, Aronian goes for a human move, which is e captures on d4. And now feel free to pause the video second time and find the second move that Anand had to play in order to create this immortal game. And actually, this reminds me of the quote for today. In any match, there are a few critical moments where there is no second best decision. The rest of the moves are intuitive. So these 4 moves, there are no second best 4 moves. Well, technically on the 4th move there is, but go ahead and pause the video and see the best idea that you have here. All right, so if you found queen to h4, it does not work. So queen to h4, h3, knight to f6. Of course, you can't capture the knight because if you do, this knight will take its spot and you will just quickly get mated. So you'll see knight captures on f6 with a check. Knight is forced to go back, but now queen to f2, and you'll just see a queen trade here. So queen captures on f2, king captures on f2, and everything is fine. So if you found queen to h4, unfortunately, it is not the greatest idea. The other idea that you may have found is what about queen to b6, getting on this diagonal. So this line is slightly better, but it still results in a draw. So let's check it out. So queen to b6, knight captures on f8, knight captures on d4 with a check, king to h1, king captures on f8. You don't want any back rank issues, so you have to capture that knight, and also this knight might become handy, so you're going to go ahead and capture that knight. Queen to e2, attacking the knight. Knight to f6, same thing as we have seen. H3, but now knight to h5. Again, you don't want to capture with a pawn. You have to capture with queen on g4. Queen captures on d3, so a knight for a bishop. Rook to d1 and knight to g3 with a check. So regardless of what you play, queen to h4 or queen to b6, both of them result in a draw. So congratulations to everyone who found bishop to c5. There are moments in chess history where certain moves are discussed, and I think this is just one of them. So congratulations to everyone who found this move in helping Anand create his immortal game. So what's the idea behind bishop to c5? Well, let's see. Can you just go ahead and capture the bishop? Because if you can, you absolutely should. So you get d captures on c5, knight captures on c5. So far, it is Anand who has sacrificed a bishop for a pawn. Knight captures on f8, queen to d4 with a check, king to h1, knight captures on d3, and I'm sure you can all just see it. the battle of f2 square, and this is going to get very, very messy. So queen to e2, and you want to be slightly careful here, right? Because if you just play queen to e2, getting out of the rook's pin, you're going to quickly get mated. And let's actually see it. So you get knight to f2 with a check. Let's say if the rook captures, you get knight captures on f2 with a check, and you're going to again get quickly mated. So you have double check from the knight and the queen. So knight to h3 with a check, king to f1, but now queen to g1 with a checkmate. So ideally not the way you actually want to play this. So after you get knight captures on d3, the way you actually want to play it is h3. Again, the good old h3, right? So knight to f2 with a check, and you have no choice but to give the material back. So rook captures on f2, knight captures on f2 with a check, and now king to h2. We have already discussed that you don't want to go to g1 because then you would just get double checks and you're going to lose material. So after king to h2, king captures on f8, getting the knight back. And now after unpinning, you get knight to d3. So this is most certainly playable, right? This is the best idea, the best variation, the best permutation that could happen if white decides to capture the bishop. But let's take a snapshot and see this position. This is such a dominant position for black. Just look at the harmony between all of black's pieces, and look at the sad rook that's not doing anything. Look at this sad bishop that's not doing anything. So you essentially have 4-2 advantage on the attack, and you have essentially, I shouldn't say busted, but you have kind of busted white's king. So this, in a human chess, this would be totally winning. So after bishop to c5, you do not want to capture. You don't want to capture the bishop on c5. So what's the other idea that you might have? Well, the only idea that you might have is bishop to e2, and this is what Aronian plays. So Aronian plays bishop to e2 and just says, hey, I don't want any troubles. You can have your pawn, you can have your rook, you can have your bishop. Just go ahead and take this knight away, right? That's all I ask for. But now go ahead and pause the video for the third time and see what you would play here. And let me go ahead and warn you, play as exotic of a move that you can think of. Think of Mikhail Tal, think of the romantic era of chess, think of Rashid Nashmadinov, and see what you would play here. So take 5 seconds as I take the sip of my water and see what you would play. All right. So for those of you that found queen to h4, queen to h4 is working, and let's see why it's working. So queen to h4, bishop captures on g4. Like I said, you want to get rid of that monster knight. You get bishop captures on d4 with a check, king to h1, queen captures on g4, knight captures on f8, knight to f6, because again, you're not attacking that knight anymore, so you're not in a hurry to capture the knight right now. Also, there are certain ideas, right, that knight will jump to h5 and set up attack against the white king. But now you just get queen to e2, queen to h3. Of course, you can't capture because of this beautiful bishop. And whenever you're playing a game like this, and imagine aliens from Mars came to Earth, and they asked you, they had death beams pointed at Earth, and they said, "Hey, let's play a game of chess. If you win, we'll leave, but if you lose, we'll destroy the Earth." Um, these, if they had death beams, this is exactly what it would look like, right? Like, just look at these Martian bishop pair, the devil's bishop pair, right? That has been dominating throughout this game. So you get queen to h3. Again, you can't capture. F5, trying to open up the F file for F5 square. I'm sorry, F4 square. So the bishop on c1 can jump to f4, but now you just get e5, rook to f3, just stopping any action. You just go into a massive capture fest now. Bishop captures on f3, queen captures on f3, queen captures on f3, captures, and king captures on f8. And again, this is absolutely winning for Black, right? Especially the player, the caliber of Viswanathan Anand. If you give him the rook, knight, and just these beautiful pawn structure compared to the doubled F pawns, and you have 4 different pawn islands now, right? One on the F file, one on the C file, one on the A file, and the other on the H file. Viswanathan Anand is not losing a game like this. So yeah, after bishop to e2, if you found queen to h4, it is winning, but the move that you had to find was knight to e5. Eat your heart out, Mikhail Tal. I mean, just appreciate the beauty of this position. And right, this pawn has been hanging since forever. This rook has been hanging since the game practically began. This bishop is hanging, has been hanging since yesterday. And now you're sacrificing the knight. I mean, this is just masterful. Viswanathan Anand just goes full Mikhail Tal, full Rashid Nazmetdinov. I think Mikhail Tal had a saying that if you have 3 pieces hanging, offer a 4th one, because when it comes time for your opponent, he or she can only capture 1 piece because they only get 1 move. So poor Levon Aronian, I mean, he must have been seeing the ghost of Mikhail Tal or Rashid Najmadinov, both of whom will actually pay tribute to throughout this game. Throughout this COVID-19 relief effort series. And well, we have paid tribute to them in this game as well, by mentioning just the beautiful permutation on this board. Okay, so knight to e5. Let's see what could happen, right? We have already discussed d captures on c5. It's not going to work out. Let's see what would happen if you get f captures on e5, the newly offered knight. So you get queen captures on d4 with a check, king to h1, and I'm sure you can all see this. Queen to g1 with a check. Rook captures on g1. Of course, you can't capture with the king because of the bishop. And now the smothered mate, knight to f2. And this is just beautiful, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with the smothered mates, this is what it looks like. Probably my favorite form of checkmate. So of course, after knight to e5, you can't take the bishop, you can't take the knight. So what's the other idea that you may have? Well, let's check out our good old h3. So after h3, you get bishop captures on d4 with a check. You get king to h1, queen to h4, pinning the pawn, and now of course you have to bring the bring the knight back to protect the pawn on h3, because again, queen is just ready to pounce on that pawn, and you won't be able to capture because of the bishop. So knight comes back to f5 to defend the pawn on h3. But now you just get f5, adding opening up file for rook. F captures on e5. Knight to f2 with a check. King to h2. Bishop captures on e5 with a check. King to g1. Queen to g3, going for the mating attack right there. Well, not fast once you move the knight, of course. So bishop to f3, trying to just tame this Martian bishop. Just bishop here from hell almost. Knight to e4, finally going for the attack. Going for the checkmate, but now you get knight captures on e4, queen to h2 with a check, king to f2, f captures on e4, queen captures on e4, bishop captures on e4. Again, you have to sacrifice. Let's actually take a moment back. You have to sacrifice the queen here. Why? Because the f file is completely open, and anything that you do, bishop is just coming back with a check, and you are just getting mated pretty quickly. So here you will just have to start sacrificing the material, or just get mated pretty quickly. So after f captures on e4, you just have to give up your queen. Bishop captures on e4, knight captures on e4, rook captures on f3. Again, just massive initiative. King captures on f3, rook to f8 with a check. King to e2, queen captures on g2 with a check, rook to f2, and now queen captures on e4 with a check. And again, this is, of course, winning for black by a mile. So you can't capture the bishop. You can't capture the knight. You can't play the good old h3 that we have been playing so far. So Aronian just goes for the only legitimate idea that he has, which is bishop captures on g4. So after bishop captures on g4, you get bishop captures on d4 with a check, king goes to h1, knight captures on g4, getting that piece back, and now knight captures on f8. Feel free to pause the video one more time and see what you would play here. Because there's a very poisonous, sneaky idea here that you don't want to play. So go ahead and pause the video for 5 seconds and see what you would play here. Okay. So for those of you that decided that you wanted to play queen to h4, oh boy, you have just blundered the game. Let's see why you have blundered the game. You get queen to h7 with a check. You have to give up the queen back. So queen captures on h7, knight captures on h7, and king captures on h7. And now it is you who is down the exchange, even though you have been down the exchange throughout the game. Black is actually able to defend things well because you don't have king on h4, king on b6, or king on d4. I'm sorry, queen on d4. So if you decided to play queen to h4, that is not the correct idea. So after knight captures on f8, Vishy obviously just calmly plays f5. I think this is where he went full Arya Stark, if you ask me. And I think he said, I think Aronian asked him after playing knight to f8, what do you say to the god of party poopers? And Anand obviously replied, not today. So f5, and then you get knight to g6, because now the idea of queen to h4 is very real, followed by mate. So knight to g6, preventing any sort of infiltration to the h file. And I hope when f5 was played, I hope none of you were actually thinking about knight captures on e6, trying to fork both bishop and the queen. Why? Because it would be a checkmate pretty quick. Queen to h3, doesn't matter if you capture or play h3. Let's say if you play h3, you still get queen captures on h3, and that's a checkmate because your pawn is pinned. And that's a checkmate. So yeah, I hope none of you were thinking about, after f5, I hope none of you were thinking about capturing the pawn on e6. So instead, you get knight to g6, preventing any queen to h4 ideas. But now queen to f6, h3. And I think the best idea here would have been, so after queen to f6, the best idea would have been rook to f3. And that is the most safe, or I should say the safest recommended line from the engine. But even then, you're still going to get into an ugly position, and you're still losing. So let's check it out. Actually, rook to f3. Of course, you're going to capture the knight on g6. Queen to e2, finally unpinning, and going after some funny idea if black is not careful enough. But now you just get queen to h6, h3, bishop captures on f3. Of course, you can't capture the knight because you're pinned right now. Queen captures on f3, knight to f2 with a check, queen to h2, and then bishop goes back to b6. So this is very much playable. But with the caliber of the player like Viswanathan Anand, he's going to close this game out pretty quickly, and you're going to lose. So instead, after queen to f6, Aronian actually played h3, and now you get queen captures on g6, queen to e2 unpinning, and finally going after some ideas of e6, and also adding potentially a second attacker, not necessarily. But yeah, queen to e2, queen to h5, finally getting on the h file. And again, the best idea could have been rook to f3, as we have already discussed. But it's not any better, right? So rook to f3, and this is slightly different because your queen is no longer on h6, it's on h5. So you still get knight to f2 with a check, king to h2, bishop, and now we just go into a massive capture fest. So we get captures, 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 sorry, knight to d3, and I hope none of you are actually thinking about, so let's pause for a second. So after you get g captures on f3, you get knight to d3. I hope none of you are thinking about capturing the knight on, capturing the bishop on, b5, because you would actually quickly lose a piece, and let's see why. So if you get knight captures on b5, you get rook to c2 with a check, and doesn't matter where you move the king. Let's say you go to h1. Now you just get bishop to b6, and everything is okay here, right? For black. If anything, you're actually going to lose this bishop on c1 very quickly. So yeah, after knight to d3, this is just such a dominating position for black. And Anand would most definitely just convert. I mean, look at these two sad pawns. Look at this sad bishop. Look at this sad rook. Just not a way to treat anyone. Just no. So yeah, after queen to h5, Aronian tries to hold everything together and plays queen to d3 because he's protecting his he's protecting the pawn on h3, and you can no longer just straight out capture it and just go into a checkmate. So feel free to pause the video one last time and see what you would play here. Again, go for all the pizzazz, all the marbles, right? Just play the most beautiful move that you could think of. All right. So for those of you that found bishop to e3, congratulations. You have helped Anand finalize his immortal game. And it was actually in this position that Levon Aronian resigned the game on move 23. So why did he resign? Well, you are just blocking queen's influence on h3. I mean, of course, you can't capture with, if you capture with the queen, you're losing your queen. And again, you're getting mated pretty quickly. It's not any better if you decide to capture with the bishop, because if you capture with the bishop, you're blocking your own queen's influence on the h file. So again, it's not any better. And in this position, of course, if you found queen to h4 or knight blocks with e3, both ideas clearly work. But the move that you had to find, the dogmatic, the barbarian move, I would say, is bishop to e3. And yeah, there you have it. You have this immortal game where you just saw where you had 4 pieces hanging, and this was very much, right, like if you think about it from the era of the romantic chess, this would be considered an absolute barbarian game where you are just going full on attack. You have 4 different pieces hanging. Well, you have 3 pieces hanging. You're offering a 4th one. And as they say, nothing is sweeter than checkmate. So you can take all my pieces, but if I can checkmate you, who cares? So yeah, thank you very much for joining. That's it for today's episode. Stay tuned for our next episode where we pay tribute to Judith Polgar, the greatest female chess player of all time. And again, feel free to please like, comment, subscribe, share. Share the video with as many people as possible. And if you want to be a part of our COVID-19 relief efforts, there's a donation link in the box. But if all you do is just share this video with all your friends and family from library, bar, work, wherever, however you do it, thank you. And that's all the time we have for today.